So hello everyone, Michael Ingledew from TDW. I'm all about making you successful with your integrated product support strategies. So last week I kicked off with a list of the questions that I'm going to answer for you over the next coming weeks. The 5 main questions that I get asked on my training courses. Now, this week we're kicking off with, if you like, something that I like to consider or put in the bracket of objections. So I get asked all of the time, this is a tremendous amount of energy and effort. Why do we bother? It's only a tech pub. Are there any alternatives? So I'm going to look at how I would answer that question if I was in the classroom. Now, this pretty much comes up all of the time. I'm always asked my opinion on whether S1000D is appropriate, whether all of the energy and effort delivers the necessary ROI. We're going to look at ROI in a couple of weeks' time. And we're also asked regularly to recommend alternatives for a solid technical publication solution. Now, so before I move into this, how I answer it depends on who I'm training. So I train everyone from technical authors all the way up to commercial managers and contracting agencies. So depending on who I'm training and anybody in between, depends on how I would try to dissect it. So I'm going to try and come at this from a slightly neutral perspective and just kind of give you some ideas and food for thought. So so depending on who I'm training depends on how I would answer it. So take that for what you will out of here. Now, firstly, if you are contracted to deliver S1000D, suck it up. You're going to be doing it. Just make sure you arm yourself with the necessary questions, the necessary tools. You've got the necessary support around you, and you know how you're going to get the most and the maximum out of S1000D, but you're also going to be able to hit all of those contractual requirements that are placed on you. So if it's on you to deliver it, suck it up, people. You're going to have to do it. And there are ways that we can reduce cost. There are ways that we can reduce energy and effort, but that's outside the scope of this particular presentation. So before I try and answer this, I try to understand where the objections really lie in terms of where the alternative question comes from. So is it because we think it's too complex and it's too much of an overkill for a technical publication? And I'm going to come on to that very, very shortly, which is a sensible question. Or is it because of fear? We don't know what S1000D is. It's a huge specification. There's lots of technicalities in there. And to get the most out of S1000D, you really need to understand what the specification's telling you to do. But you also really need to understand things like structured languages, and you need to really understand a technical publication and the role of a technical publication. So, is there a fear factor there? Is there a confusion factor? I've been in organizations where they think if we use S1000D, we must use this piece of software, which is not unless it's mandated by an organization, of course, then that's a slightly different discussion. So some people take a religious dislike to something like S1000D, and they vehemently will not use it. They absolutely will not entertain it. So, and that comes down normally because they feel like they're being corralled down using a particular piece of software or a particular piece of technology. So once you disconnect the S1000D specification capability and how it's doing things from technology and from deployment capability, the conversation often becomes a little bit more, amenable to adopting something like S1000D. One of the bigger problems as well is scalability of S1000D. And there are ways that we can make it scalable. And we cover that on our S1000D courses. But, there are things that we can do and strategies that we can employ that make S1000D the cost curve of S1000D, where we spend a lot of time when we talk about ROI on our courses. We look at where the ROI sits and how can we increase that ROI by reducing the level of effort and energy up front in all of our S1000D projects. So assuming that you're still in the very much what are the alternatives, we want to be doing and using something else, there are different tools out there that I use. But the first thing that I will say, once I've decided and figured out what the objections are, is we have to disconnect S1000D equals a traditional technical publication. S1000D does give us a technical publication. The end goal is a technical publication, but it's more than a traditional technical publication. It's an engineered piece of information where there's lots of information on top of the page or on the screen for our end users, but there's lots of stuff going on behind the page, behind the screen, that our technical authors, our ILS engineers are all engineering that goes into that support information that then becomes something that we can leverage from a business perspective in multiple ways. So yes, it's a technical publication, but it's much more than a technical publication. It's an engineered publication with lots of stuff going on that we can leverage in other environments for other outputs, running queries, configuring or hiding data. We can do lots of clever and funky stuff if we do S1000D and we do data correctly. So, which is why I talk more about the role of the modern technical publication, because it's much, much more than just words and illustrations on a page. So we have to disconnect, which is why I think S1000D to the non-believers is quite badly named. A technical publication specification in many people's minds will simply just go, oh, Word equals PDF equals technical publication equals job done. Check mark. Let's move on. And from an S1000D perspective, it is much, much more intricate than that. So once we've disconnected the S1000D just equals a technical publication, we then start looking at some of the benefits of what's going on behind the page. How do we leverage structured information? Why do we use structured information? And then why S1000D builds on top of that. We also have to think about the fact that S1000D is solving many problems. It's not just solving the technical publications problem, it's solving lots of other multi-partner, multi-customer, multi-supplier problems. But it's also important to remember that S1000D does introduce some problems. We have to be aware of that. And we have to, when we dissect this question, and we dissect anything when it comes to working around these complex specifications, is that not all of them are just a magic wand and you're going to get the best of all worlds. You are going to have a trade-off. There's going to be a balance between what we get from business benefit to what we actually don't get, or the problems that it introduces. So I do spend a lot of time teaching the students a little bit about the problems that S1000D solves, and I've got some nice illustrations where we go through these are the kind of issues that S1000D solves. But so assuming that we know the problems that S1000D solves, and we disconnect S1000D equals technical publication, and we disconnect S1000D equals XML and modular data as well, because it does, but there are other tools that do exactly the same and other methodologies that do exactly the same. So we break those down a little bit. And you have to then start thinking about if you are absolutely vehemently opposed to using something like S1000D because A, it's too complex, you can't afford the software, you can't do, there are alternatives. But what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't default back to, well, let's just create a Microsoft Word document, let's create a PDF and throw it out to the customer. That's dumb data. We can still be a little bit more intelligent with the way that we create our content and we deploy our content. So there are two tools that I use, and I'm going to come on to those very shortly. I always mention DITA when I do my training courses, which is a similar methodology for the production of technical publications. I do get involved in advising clients on DITA versus S1000D, and those customers that want to use DITA will go down the DITA route, and those that want to use S1000D will go down the S1000D route. Now, it's important to say as well, there's a myth out there that if we use DITA, free to use, as is S1000D, if you're a member of those organizations, ASD, ATA, AIA, you are free to use the specifications. The DITA specification is also there for you to use free of charge, and there is something called an open toolkit that supports the DITA specification. But actually, to get the most and the maximum out of DITA, you're still going to need to work with software vendors that are going to give you specialist tools and the ability to manipulate those XML structures and work with those XML structures. So the myth is that DITA equals cheap and S1000D equals expensive. Let me just tell you, they both require a degree of investment and energy. And I've been involved on projects where, I've seen quotations for DITA-based software, and it's comparable to if you were buying an S1000D solution for your organization. So that's myth number one. Now, it is true that many of the software tools that are out there off the shelf will actually support DITA off the shelf. So you can go and buy a license of Adobe FrameMaker, for example, and you could start working with DITA topics and those kind of things straight away. But you're still going to have to work with a specialist vendor to get something meaningful and useful out to your end users or to wherever you're deploying that content. So I want to dispel that little myth here. But so DITA, very similar to S1000D in the way that it works. In my view, DITA does do things in slightly better. There are a couple of things that DITA does do that makes it a little bit more, and we cover this on my training course, but it makes it a little bit more easier for organizations to adopt. But that being said, there are some very, very good strengths in S1000D that are not covered in DITA. So we do that on my training courses. We cover those. And so the two tools that I use that if I'm So let's be absolutely clear, honest and transparent here, and you won't find many people say this. S1000D is not for all projects. Okay, it is not something that, it's not everything to everyone, and it shouldn't be just seen as S1000D is the yellow brick road that we're going to follow, and we're not going to do that for all of our projects. But again, that doesn't mean that there are not alternatives out there that mean we can still create good, engaging and quality content that is something for us to easily manage, manipulate and configure in terms of how we want to send it out to an end user. So two tools that I use. That's what you're still sat there patiently waiting to hear. Two tools that I use, and I use them both for very different reasons. One is called Adobe RoboHelp, and the other one is called Madcap Flare. Now, I have licenses of both, and I use both for different reasons depending on what I'm trying to achieve. So if you have done any of my training courses, you will have used some Madcap Flare content. So that is, we create a knowledge base and interactions with our technical content, our training material in Madcap Flare. If I've printed something for you, that has probably come from something like InDesign. So we have InDesign where we can create some really engaging content using a magnificent plugin called In5 that sits on top of InDesign. And if you want more tutorials on any of these, RoboHelp, In5, InDesign, and Madcap Flare, like and send me either a comment or comment below to say yes please, more tutorials on those, because we'll do those. But the ones that I'm going to talk about today, if you've downloaded our rapid guide to S1000D, I'll put a link down below. That's created with InDesign and a plugin called In5, which means that we can create, and now InDesign is a heavy hitting and industry strength publications and editing tool. And with In5, you can export decent, high quality, engaging, interactive HTML5 content. To see an example, just go to the link below, go sign up to our rapid guide, and you'll see that's coming from InDesign with a HTML5 output. RoboHelp is a tool that I know many of the software vendors out there are using to create their user guides for their software and integrating that into their tools. And that's because, you know, S1000D is too much of a big hammer for those kind of user guides. So they will create something maybe just using off-the-shelf templates in RoboHelp. Now, there are things that RoboHelp does that Madcap Flare doesn't do, and I'm going to do some tutorials on those, comparing them. RoboHelp is really good at dynamic content filtering, and I'm talking about runtime when the end user's accessing that content. Madcap Flare is not so strong. So RoboHelp is a tool that I use a lot. Flare is another tool that I use, and I use that because it's not something that we would find traditionally in the aerospace, defense and space market. I know some of you out there are using it. I know, so before you start sending in the hate, I know that some of you are using that tool. But it uses, both of these tools use structured and topic-based methodologies, and you can create topic-based reusable content type methodologies for creating your content, and then you can publish it. Now, of course, the reality is that if you're creating something so we use Flare and RoboHelp to create HTML5 output that we can then embed into apps or into our training material or to any of our website contents for any of the. If you've looked at TDW Plus and you've started going through some of the S1000D guidance that we've got up there, that is created in Madcap Flare. Topic-based, works really well, and it was easy for us and quick and easy for us to get going, get writing and get producing really, really quickly without having to develop things like business rules and Brex modules and applicability statements and all these kind of things. We just got off and writing and we got doing what we were doing. So, but you have to be cognizant of security, ITAR, as you do with anything when you're deploying our technical information. So those are the three main tools that I use. So the magazine, the TDW magazine, we create, and a lot of our training content we create in InDesign with In5. Same with Madcap Flare for our interactive stuff. And for some, a couple of years ago, I did an example of how we converted a legacy manual to DITA, and we used RoboHelp for that. And it was just off the shelf published output that was much more than just visual presentation of data. There was much more going on behind. So those three tools, and I nearly said two, those three tools are the ones that are in my toolkit as I go forward. Now I've got unstructured FrameMaker and structured FrameMaker as well, but right now we're talking about the end deliverable of a technical publication where I publish my content is pretty much using those tools. If you want more content on that on this channel, let me know. So that's how I would approach this question. Understand what the objections are, who am I actually training, and answer it specifically to that audience, and try and dispel some of the myths and some of the fear factor around S1000D, look at some of the alternatives, and we would, in my training courses, open up those individual tools, InDesign, RoboHelp, Madcap Flare, and I do know that there are some alternatives out there. I'm just saying those are the tools in my toolkit. But S1000D is not for everyone, but it is actually a very, very powerful methodology for the production and configuration of our technical publications to meet a variety of end user and customer needs. And it solves a lot of problems, but it does introduce some problems. So if I've mentioned any tools, that's not necessarily my endorsement that you should run off and buy those tools. I'm just saying those are the tools that I use. I'm mentioning those tools without the knowledge of the software companies themselves. So I'm not being paid, endorsed or whatever to mention those. This is Ingeldew's opinion that I'm just sharing with you. So that's question number one. I hope you found that useful. I can't remember what we're answering next week, but tune in for next week. Please do like and subscribe, because that lets me know that we're doing the right kind of content for you over the coming weeks and months. So hopefully that works for you. And I'm Michael Ingledew. As my light just went out behind me, the battery's just died. I will speak to you next week.